So let's talk about safety gear, the different types, and how they're used. Before we even get into that, there's a principle we need to cover. When thinking about the legal aspect of what safety gear you have to wear, there's two standards you have to pay attention to. First off is the pesticide label. Remember that the pesticide label, it's a legal document. It defines, it hems in the boundaries by which you can use that pesticide. That label, it's going to tell you the type of safety gear that you need to use. But it's not only the label you have to pay attention to, you also have to pay attention to DPR's regulations. And sometimes, I know this might be shocking, but sometimes the label and the regulations, they say different things. They have different requirements. So this is what you do. You always follow the strictest standard. There's a number of different types of safety gear that you might have to wear, depending on what the label or the regulations require. These are things all the way from coveralls, like either one-piece coverall with a zipper or a two-piece uniform that has long sleeves or long pants, eye protection, some kind of eye protection, chemical-resistant gloves, of course shoes and socks at the very least, or perhaps chemical-resistant footwear, chemical-resistant clothing. This would be like, think of it like a hazmat suit, right? For the really toxic pesticides, you might be required not just to wear coveralls like cotton or disposable paper coveralls, but actually something that's more like a rubber hazmat suit. Chemical-resistant headgear, chemical-resistant aprons, and respiratory protective equipment, like respirators. So let's first talk about the types of safety gear that's required by regulation. There are not many of them. Coveralls, eye protection, chemical-resistant gloves. These are all three things that are required by DPR regulations. Now in coveralls, let's be clear about what we mean here. They can be either disposable or washable. They can be one piece with a zipper, or they could be two-piece like pants and a shirt, as long as they're long pants and long sleeves. Eye protection can't just be regular glasses or sunglasses. It has to be either lab goggles or a splash or face shield, or safety glasses, impact glasses, with extra brow and temple protection on the sides. And then chemical-resistant gloves. For the most part, you're never going to be able to use cloth or leather gloves when handling pesticides, because obviously those cloth or leather gloves are absorbent, and they will actually increase your exposure risk to the pesticide. But oddly enough, there are some pesticides that actually ask you to wear cotton gloves or no gloves. But it depends on the type of pesticide you're using. So you really have to pay attention to the label. Now these other types of safety gear, there aren't any DPR regulations that specifically require them, but they'd be something that you'd have to wear depending on what the label tells you to use. Shoes and socks, certainly, I mean, you know there's no pesticides out there that the label says wear flip-flops, right? Chemical-resistant footwear in some cases, chemical-resistant clothing, headgear, aprons, and then respirators. Let's spend a moment talking about chemical-resistant clothing. And one of the first things I want to get across is that when we say chemical-resistant clothing, we're not talking about regular coveralls. We're not talking about washable coveralls, like made of cotton, or Tyvek, or some kind of disposable type coverall. When we say chemical-resistant clothing, probably the best image that you should use is hazmat type gear, right? Rubberized, laminated, heavier, very warm to wear. In fact, this kind of safety gear is so warm, so hot to wear, that there's actually a DPR regulation that prohibits the use of pesticides that have labels that require chemical-resistant clothing when daytime temperatures exceed 80 degrees Fahrenheit or nighttime temperatures are hotter than 85 degrees. At that point, the risk posed by heat-related illness because of the safety gear is actually as risky maybe as the pesticide risk itself. So while we're at it here, we should probably talk about heat-related illness prevention. So earlier I mentioned there was a relationship between pesticide use and heat-related illness. And the relationship is actually very, very simple. It kind of goes like this. You're wearing safety gear because you're handling a pesticide, and that safety gear makes you warmer. It's not more complicated than that. It really doesn't have anything to do with pesticide toxicology. It just has to do with the fact that the safety gear is really warm to wear. So let's talk about the symptoms of heat-related illness. First off, sweating. Now, sweating's not really a symptom of the illness because sweating is natural. Sweating is a way that your body cools itself. When you stop sweating, that's when things get serious, right? Because your body uses sweat to cool your body off. But if you're dehydrated or you haven't drank enough water during that day and the weather is hot, if you stop sweating, that's when you're headed into dangerous territory. So you may start feeling tired or weak or even dizzy. Maybe you're starting to get a throbbing headache. Maybe you've got a heat rash, right? Like small red bumps on your arms or legs or back. You start getting a heat rash. The symptoms can progress beyond that to a feeling of nausea, muscle cramps, convulsions, trembling, fainting, coma, and then death. So let's talk about when you're at the greatest risk for heat-related illness. First off, you aren't used to working in the heat. This can happen to anybody, no matter where you live. Those days in the springtime, late spring or early summer when it starts to get hot, the first couple of hot days, your body is not used to that heat yet. Maybe you were used to it last summer, but it's all brand new for your body this year. So the first really hot days of the season, you're really at risk. Maybe you're new to working outdoors, or it's a different kind of job for you. Maybe you've had a desk job in an air-conditioned situation, and now you're out in the field where it's hot. You're going to be at increased risk because your body is not used to that heat yet. Maybe you had heat-related illness symptoms the day before. You drank a bunch of water, got in the shade, and you feel better when you get up in the morning. But you got to know that that day, the next day, you're still at greater risk because you had those symptoms the day before. Maybe you're not physically fit or you're overweight. Maybe you're drinking alcohol or taking drugs. You're wearing dark, heavy, or tight clothing. All of these things will contribute to an increased risk of heat-related illness. And if you're wearing personal protective equipment like you're supposed to when you're handling pesticides. So here's some things you should do. If you feel the symptoms of heat-related illness, the first thing you need to do is tell your supervisor or a coworker right away. The early symptoms, they might seem minor. A headache, feeling a little dizzy. You might not feel like you need to share that with anyone. Further on, those symptoms are not apparent to anyone else. So if you start to feel those symptoms, you need to tell somebody right away. As the symptoms progress, you may not have the mental capacity to know how serious the situation is for you. Here's some tips about avoiding heat-related illness. Drink plenty of water. You know, here's an easy way to remember this. Once the temperature gets above 80 or 85 degrees, you should be drinking at least a quart an hour. Now, if you're somebody like me, not that I want to give you too much personal information here, but I sweat a lot. So for me, probably more than a quart or more than a liter an hour. Rest in the shade. Take breaks in the shade. Maybe take that safety gear off while you're taking a break. Watch out for each other, too, particularly if the weather is very warm. Wear hats for shading, right, or light-colored and not tight-fitting clothing. Drink water certainly rather than sodas, coffees, or even energy drinks. I want to spend some time talking about respiratory protective equipment. And I want to compare respiratory protective equipment to all the other types of safety gear. Imagine that I'm your boss. And as your boss, I have to give you the safety gear that you need to use. So if I'm giving you eye protection, I'm going to hand you that eye protection. I'm going to say, here, these are yours. Wear them. As your employer, I don't have to do anything else. I just have to provide them and make sure you know that you're supposed to wear them. And that's true for all the types of safety gear except for respirators. When it comes to respirators, there are more requirements on the employer. So first off, let's be clear about this definition of what a respirator is. Now, all of us are familiar with the cartridge type respirator, the half mask or maybe full face respirator. Those are fairly easily recognizable as a respirator. There also might be types of respiratory protection like SCBAs that provide you your own source of oxygen. There's also filtering facepiece type respirators that look a little bit more like the dust masks that you would wear when you were like painting or sanding something or doing woodwork. But those filtering facepiece respirators, if you take a close look at them, they're not the scrunchy, cheap dust masks. They're sturdier in construction. They often have two adjustment straps, and they might have an exhalation valve too. So we often call them dust masks, but they're actually respirators. Before you use a respirator, your employer has to make sure that you're fit tested for that respirator. Now, a fit test is a test by which we tell if the respirator fits on your face and makes an adequate seal to prevent toxic materials from getting around the face piece. Fit tests are usually done with using chemicals that smell strong or taste sweet, maybe banana oil or saccharin or something like that. So the testing would be putting the mask on, and the tester will expose the outside of that mask to that chemical. That's a fit test. You also have to have a medical evaluation by a physician, or there are actually online services that you can use that respirator manufacturers have to get that medical evaluation. The medical evaluation is important because there are certain health problems that people have that may make wearing a respirator unsafe. For example, if you have high blood pressure or heart disease or lung disease or claustrophobia even, or dermatitis, you're sensitive to rubber or synthetic materials in your skin. All of these would be medical conditions that may make it unwise for you to use a respirator. Pesticide decontamination. The employer must provide some things at the mix and load site when pesticides in category 1 and 2 are used. The employer has to provide liquid soap, water for emergency washing, and paper towels. This decontamination material must be available at the mix and load site, and an extra set of coveralls must be available as well. Now this is for category 1 and 2 outside of farming settings. If you're working in an agricultural or crop production setting, the soap, water, and paper towels is actually required for categories 1, 2, and 3. Hazard communication, that's something else the employer has to provide. The employees must have access to information about the pesticides they use, about the risks or the hazards in their workplace. So the employer has to provide pesticide use records so the employees know what pesticides they've been handling, copies of pesticide product labels, copies of pesticide safety data sheets, formerly called material safety data sheets, copies of pesticide safety training records so the employee can see what pesticides they've been trained to use, and copies of some information leaflets from DPR called the Pesticide Safety Information Series. All of this information needs to be available anytime during regular work hours when the employee wants to have access to it. A good suggestion for something like this for employers is to put all this information in a binder and have it available at the office for employees to look at anytime they want during regular work hours. Let's talk about safe work practices. Now, the importance of safe work practices is that these are ways that you can handle the pesticide and reduce your exposure. All roads lead back to this hazard equals toxicity times exposure. No matter how toxic the pesticide is, you can reduce your hazard by handling that pesticide safely and using the proper safety gear. So a complete copy of the pesticide label must be available at the pesticide mix and load site. Think of it this way. If you were applying a pesticide and a county or state inspector came and inspected you, made an inspection, one of the first things they're going to ask is a complete copy of the pesticide label. It has to be there at the use site. All service containers also have to be labeled. So get the picture here. You have to have the complete pesticide label maybe on the container of the pesticide you're using, right? And if you put that pesticide into something like a backpack sprayer, that secondary container, like that backpack sprayer, it's called a service container. And that service container actually has to have labeling too. But it only has to have 3 pieces of information. The name of the pesticide, the signal word of that pesticide that comes from the labeling, right? And the name of the business or government agency that's responsible for that container. That's all that needs to be on that service container. It can be as simple as a lot of companies use a laminated card with those 3 pieces of information on there, and they just zip tie it to the backpack or have interchangeable cards they can use. It is important, though, that the service container have its proper labeling. Something else to keep in mind, too. If your spray tank is greater than 49 gallons, you've got to have some external method to see how full the tank is, right? Now, if the tank is see-through, if you can see through it, then you can see where the tank is. It's getting close to being filled, right? One thing you want to avoid is spilling that pesticide out onto the ground while you're filling the container, the mixed container, right? So a clear container, that would That would be acceptable. Or maybe a sight tube, a plastic sight tube on the side of the container. Just some way to see when the pesticide mix tank is getting close to being full so it doesn't overflow. Also, if you had some kind of automatic shutoff device that would shut off the pesticide or shut off the water when it's being filled when it gets near the top, that would be acceptable as well. Spray tanks also must be equipped with an air gap separator or some kind of device that prevents the pesticide mix from flowing back into the water source. Here's a graphic of that. This is what it should look like. You see the filler hose coming into the tank, but the hose is not all the way down into the pesticide solution, right? You've got that air gap, that separation at the top near the opening of the tank. I mean, actually, this can be as simple as you holding it above the tank, right? As long as you're not putting that hose inside the solution. If you had some kind of pump failure or pressure failure in the system, you might backflow the pesticide into the water source. You want to avoid that. When it comes to pesticide containers, here's a couple things you've got to keep in mind. You can't leave that container unattended. It either has to be under lock and key or under your control at all times. Don't leave pesticide containers unattended. If you're storing pesticides, if you're storing Category 1 or 2 pesticides, now remember, Category 1, these are the very highly toxic pesticides. Category 2 are the moderately toxic pesticides. So if you're storing these higher toxicity pesticides, not only do you have to have a lock enclosure, but you have to have a sign as well. Now the sign should be in English and in Spanish, and perhaps if a third language is appropriate, you should have that sign in a third language. For example, if your employees speak a different language than English or Spanish, you should have that sign in the language understood by your employees. Let's talk about pesticide container disposal. Pesticides and their unrinsed containers are considered hazardous materials. What this means is you can't just throw them away in a dumpster somewhere. DPR regulations say that empty pesticide containers that have held a liquid, when the container is less than 28 gallons in volume, this container must be triple rinsed at the time of use. And that rinsate must be put back into the spray tank and either used to mix up the next batch of pesticide, or that dilute rinsate should be sprayed out at the use site. The idea is to not leave that site with pesticide residues. Put all the pesticide residues there on the use site. It can be as simple as once you're done spraying, you fill the tank back up, the spray tank back up with that triple rinsed rinsate, maybe a little bit more water, and just spray that rinsate onto the ground nearby or a patch of weeds. Just get rid of it at the use site. Don't take that rinsate back to your shop. Properly rinsed pesticide containers may be disposed of as regular waste, right, in a dumpster. In some counties, though, in California, and you should check with your county ag department, they may have disposal programs where they want to inspect your empties. It's not true for every county, so I would encourage you to contact your county agricultural commissioner's office and ask about disposal programs. Now we're going to talk about re-entering areas that have been sprayed by a pesticide. And we're going to talk about this in two different fashions. First off, we're going to talk about crop production settings, agricultural settings. And then next, we'll talk about settings that are not agricultural. So in crop production settings, the pesticide label, or DPR regulations, may specify a waiting period from the date of application until workers may re-enter that treated area. Let me give you an example. Maybe on a particular insecticide that's used in asparagus production, the label may say, when using this product on asparagus, do not allow workers to re-enter treated fields for 2 days. That would be a 2-day restricted entry interval. Now these time periods, these re-entry periods, are based on an estimation of how long we figure it will take for that pesticide to break down to a level that would not be toxic to agricultural workers. It's important for you to know that this is not guesswork. The breakdown time is determined via laboratory experiments where we look at the breakdown of the chemical over time and make a scientific estimation of that breakdown time. Now let's talk about non-farming settings. If the pesticide label indicates that people can re-enter treated areas when the spray is dried, then there's no requirement for posting any signs. But if that waiting period that's indicated on the label indicates that the re-entry period is greater than 24 hours, then you actually have to post a sign warning the public not to enter the treated area. Emergency medical care. This is something that the employer has to do for the employees. So when handling pesticides, the employer has to provide the name, address, and contact information for the closest medical facility. Now, this information has to be in a written form, and it needs to be posted in a prominent place at the work site or in the work vehicle. A lot of times when you're applying pesticides, you're not doing it at the office, you're doing it at a remote location. So this information should be posted maybe on the back windshield of the service vehicle you're using. Name of the hospital, address, and contact information. In case of a pesticide emergency, here's some things to keep in mind. Immediate decontamination. If you get that pesticide substantially on your skin or on your safety gear, you need to take off that contaminated safety gear, wash the affected body parts immediately to stop that exposure. If you get those pesticides in your eye, it's important that you rinse out your eyes for 15 minutes using appropriately temperatured water. Not too hot, not too cold. If necessary, take a shower and make sure to remove any contaminated clothing or gear. If the person experiences any injury or illness due to the pesticide exposure, you need to take them to a doctor. It's important to remember that employers cannot ask employees to drive themselves to the doctor if they've been injured or made ill when using a pesticide. And when you go to the doctor, it's advisable to bring a copy of a label or safety data sheet with you so the doctor knows the exact identity of the pesticide that was handled. I want to spend a moment talking about medical supervision. Now, it's important that you know that, first off, medical supervision means blood tests. The second thing you need to know is most people that use pesticides will never have to have medical supervision. They're never going to have a blood test. But if you're working in agriculture, in crop production, and you're using the higher toxicity pesticides, then you may have to get a blood test. So let's spend some time talking about that. First off, these are only required for farming or other types of agricultural production, right? You're growing something, growing a crop, you're growing timber, you're growing something, nursery stock. It's only for agricultural production. It's only required for the higher toxicity insecticides that are cholinesterase inhibitors. So the cholinesterase inhibitors, they're central nervous system poisons. The organophosphate type insecticides and the N-methylcarbamate insecticides, these are the very high toxicity compounds that are central nervous system poisons. If you're handling those and you're handling them in farming, then there's a good chance you're going to need that blood test. The blood test itself doesn't measure the pesticide. It measures the level of the bloodstream enzyme cholinesterase that's in the bloodstream. So a depressed cholinesterase level in your test would indicate an overexposure to organophosphates and carbamates. Now we're all done with our section on personal protective equipment, and so you know what that means. Time for a quiz.